The last message, the train car was nearly empty, save for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak as the carriage swayed on its tracks. Emma sat near the back, her face partially illuminated by the glow of her phone. She was scrolling absent-mindedly through her emails when one message caught her eye. Subject, urgent, read immediately. From unknown, she frowned. For her, the doors chimed, signaling they were about to close. Emma's feet remained rooted to the spot. The man turned fully toward the train, and she swore she saw something glint in his hand, a knife. Do you trust me? The email had said. There were only two other passengers, a young man with headphones bobbing his head to an unheard beat, and an older woman flipping through a paperback novel. Neither seemed out of the ordinary. She read the message again. How did they know her name? And her station? Her pulse quickened as paranoia set in. The train conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. Next stop, Franklin Square. That was her station. She stood, gripping the cold metal pole beside her seat, her gaze darting to the doors, but then she remembered the email. Do not get off at your station tonight. She hesitated. The train slowed, and the doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Emma craned her neck to peer out. The platform was eerily empty, save for a lone figure standing in the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure took a step forward, revealing a man in a dark hoodie, his face obscured. He turned his head sharply, scanning the platform as if searching for someone. For her, the doors chimed, signaling they were about to close. Emma's feet remained rooted to the spot. The man turned fully toward the train, and she swore she saw something glint in his hand, a knife. Do you trust me? The email had said. The doors closed with a thud, and the train lurched forward, leaving the station and the shadowy figure behind. Emma sank back into her seat, her hands trembling. Her phone buzzed again. Another email. Subject, good. Now listen carefully. She opened it with shaky fingers. You're in danger, but I'm here to help. Stay on the train until the end of the line. Don't speak to anyone. I'll find you. Emma's blood ran cold. Who was this person? How did they know so much about her? And what kind of danger was she in? Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't an email. It was a text from an unknown number. Look to your left. Emma's breath caught as she slowly turned her head. The young man with the headphones was no longer bobbing to his music. He was staring directly at her. Here's what happens next. Emma's breath hitched as the man's eyes bore into hers. His lips didn't move, but he reached up and tugged at the wire of his headphones, letting them fall loosely around his neck. His expression was unreadable, but his posture had shifted alert, predatory. Her phone buzzed again. Do not react. Keep calm. Stand up slowly. Move to the next car. Emma swallowed hard, clutching her phone as if it were a lifeline. She gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod to herself and slid her coat off her lap, letting it drop to the seat beside her. With practiced casualness, she stood, gripping the pole for balance. The man didn't move, but his eyes followed her as she took a step toward the door connecting to the next car. Her hand reached for the latch, and she pulled it open. The sound of rushing wind filled her ears as she crossed the short metal platform and stepped into the next carriage. This car was emptier, save for a single man sitting near the front, engrossed in a book. The door hissed shut behind her, and she exhaled in relief. Her phone buzzed again. Good. Now, sit near the back. The man with the book is harmless. You're almost safe. Almost. The word felt like a trap. Emma scanned the car, taking slow steps to the back. She didn't dare glance behind her, but her instinct screamed that the man from the previous car wasn't far behind. She sank into the corner seat and forced herself to look calm, even as her pulse hammered in her ears. The train's intercom crackled again. End of the line approaching, Riverside Terminal. The doors closed with a thud, and the train lurched forward, leaving the station and the shadowy figure behind. Emma sank back into her seat, her hands trembling. Her phone buzzed again. Another email. Subject, good. Now listen carefully. She opened it with shaky fingers. You're in danger, but I'm here to help. Stay on the train until the end of the line. Don't speak to anyone. I'll find you. The doors hissed open, revealing the dimly lit platform of Riverside Terminal. It was almost completely deserted, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of footsteps. Emma hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping off the train. The cold air bit at her skin as she glanced toward the signs overhead. South exit, an arrow pointed to the right. Her legs carried her forward faster than she intended. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't dare look at it now. She could hear it, a second set of footsteps behind her, closing in. She broke into a run. The footsteps quickened, their rhythm heavy and deliberate. Her chest burned as she rounded a corner, the glowing south exit sign drawing closer. A voice called out behind her, low and commanding. "Emma, stop." She didn't. Bursting through the exit doors, she found herself in an empty parking lot lit by a single flickering street lamp. She whipped around, scanning the lot for anything that could explain this madness. Her phone buzzed again. She fumbled to unlock it, her fingers trembling so hard she nearly dropped it. "You're safe, for now," her breath caught. A shadow moved across the lot, and Emma's head snapped up. A man emerged from behind a parked van, his face hidden beneath a black hoodie. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The man raised his hands in surrender. "I'm the one who sent the emails." "Why should I believe you?" He stepped closer, keeping his hands visible. "Because if I hadn't, you'd already be dead." Emma froze, torn between the instinct to flee and the need to know the truth. Her pulse roared in her ears as she kept her distance from the man. "How do I know you're not lying?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man took another step forward, his face still hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. "You don't," he admitted. "But think about it. Who else knew your name, your station?" "I've been tracking them for weeks, trying to stop what's coming." Emma's breath hitched. "Them? Who's them?" The man lowered his hood slightly, revealing sharp, tired eyes and a jagged scar running along his jaw. "The ones who've been watching you, the ones who want what you have." She shook her head, backing up until her shoulders hit the cold metal of a light pole. "I don't have anything. I'm just a teacher, a nobody." He interrupted her, his voice rising. "That's what they want you to think. But they've been targeting people like you, people with something they don't even realize they have." "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her fear giving way to anger. He reached into his pocket slowly, his movements deliberate, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Look, this was found in the apartment of someone just like you. She disappeared 3 days ago." He unfolded the paper and handed it to her cautiously. Emma took it with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the page. It was a crudely drawn map with an address circled in red, her address. Her blood ran cold. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man stepped closer, his tone softening. "They're after a code, one that's hidden in plain sight. A cipher tied to something your family left behind, something you didn't even know you inherited." Emma shook her head, her grip tightening on the paper. "I don't know anything about a cipher. My family." She paused, the memory hitting her like a freight train. Her late father's journal. She had packed it away in a box after his death, too grief-stricken to look through it. The journal had always been his obsession, filled with strange symbols and cryptic notes that she chalked up to his eccentricity. "Your father," the man said, as if reading her thoughts. "He knew. And now, so do they." The sound of a car engine rumbled in the distance, drawing their attention. Headlights cut through the darkness, growing closer. The man stiffened. "They're here." Emma's heart slammed against her ribs. Who's here?" No time to explain. The man grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the shadows. "If they catch you, they won't just take the journal. They'll kill you." Panic surged through her as the car skidded to a stop near the exit. 2 figures stepped out, their movements precise and menacing. They carried no weapons that Emma could see, but their presence alone was enough to send a chill down her spine. "Run," the man hissed, shoving her toward the alley behind the lot. She stumbled but caught her balance, her instincts screaming at her to obey. As her feet pounded against the pavement, she heard the low voices of the figures behind her and the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. The man's voice echoed after her. "Don't stop. Find the journal." With Emma ran until her lungs she burned, pulled it out and her legs threatened to give out. "There's a safe house. She ducked into an abandoned storefront, 327 low behind a dusty counter. Get there." Her phone buzzed in her pocket. The sound of footsteps grew louder outside. She clutched her phone and braced herself. Emma peered through a crack in the storefront's shattered window. The 2 figures from the car were scanning the street, their movements methodical. One of them spoke into a device clipped to his lapel, though she couldn't hear what was said. The other, taller and broader, pulled something from his pocket, a slim, cylindrical object with a faint red glow at its tip. Her breath hitched. A tracker? A weapon? She didn't want to wait to find out, clutching her phone. Emma crept toward the back of the store, her steps muffled by years of dust and debris. She found a rear exit and pushed it open as quietly as she could, her pulse pounding in her ears. The alley behind the store was dark, the air thick with the stench of garbage. She glanced down the narrow lane, her eyes locking onto a street sign in the distance. Birchwood Lane was to her right, 2 blocks. She could make it. She darted into the shadows, moving as swiftly and silently as she could. Her phone buzzed again, and she risked a glance at the screen. "They're tracking your phone." "Ditch it." Now her heart sank. The phone was her lifeline, her only source of guidance. But the message made sense. She could feel the weight of their pursuit behind her, an invisible thread tying her to their relentless chase. With trembling hands, she powered the phone off and slipped it into a dumpster as she passed. She felt a pang of panic without it, but the silence that followed was oddly reassuring. The distant rumble of an engine reached her ears, followed by the faint shuffle of footsteps on pavement. They were still coming. She pushed herself harder, her legs screaming with every step. At last, she saw it, 327 Birchwood Lane, a modest, nondescript house with boarded-up windows and a sagging porch. It looked abandoned, but the faint glow of a light seeping through the cracks told her otherwise. She raced up the steps and tried the door. Locked. Panic surged as she pounded on the wood. "Hello? Is anyone there?" she hissed, her voice urgent but low. The sound of approaching footsteps made her blood run cold. She pounded harder, desperate now. "Please." The door creaked open just as a shadow emerged at the end of the street. A hand shot out, grabbed her wrist, and yanked her inside. The door slammed shut, and Emma found herself face to face with a woman in her 50s, her gray hair tied back in a severe bun. She wore a black turtleneck and jeans, her piercing green eyes scanning Emma with military precision. "You weren't followed, were you?" the woman asked, her voice clipped. Emma shook her head, still catching her breath. "They're close, but I don't think they saw me come in." The woman nodded and locked several deadbolts on the door before motioning for Emma to follow. "We don't have much time." They moved into a dimly lit living room. The walls were lined with maps, photographs, and pages of notes connected by red string, a conspiracy theorist's dream. The woman gestured to a chair. "Sit, we need to talk." Emma sank into the chair, her legs barely supporting her anymore. "Who are you?" "My name's Marisol," the woman said, sitting across from her. "I work with people who are trying to stop them, the people after you." Emma's mind raced. The man on the train said they're after my father's journal. That it has some kind of code. Marisol's expression darkened. "Your father was part of something big, something dangerous? That journal holds the key to a cipher they've been trying to crack for years. If they get their hands on it..." She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Let's just say it won't end well for any of us." Emma's chest tightened. "I don't even know where it is. I packed it away after he died. I haven't looked at it since." Marisol stood and began rummaging through a desk drawer. "We'll figure that out. For now, we need to buy some time. They'll tear this city apart looking for you." She pulled out a small device and handed it to Emma. It looked like a thumb drive. "What's this?" Emma asked. "A decoy," Marisol said. "We're going to let them think they've won. But first, you're going to need to trust me, because the next part isn't going to be easy." Before Emma could respond, the sound of glass shattering echoed from the back of the house. "They're here," Marisol said, her voice ice cold. "Get ready to run." Emma's heart pounded as the sound of heavy boots echoed from the back of the house. Marisol grabbed a bag from under the desk, slinging it over her shoulder, and shoved a small handgun into Emma's hands. "Point and shoot if you have to." Emma cried. Marisol yanked the wheel, taking a hard turn onto a side street. Not for long. The car roared through the narrow streets, weaving through alleys and cutting through abandoned lots. Marisol's driving was relentless, her focus unbreakable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pursuing car vanished from sight. Marisol pulled into an overgrown lot and killed the engine. For a long moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. "We're safe," Marisol said at last, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. Emma leaned back, her head spinning. "What now?" "This way." The sound of footsteps grew louder as they slipped into the narrow tunnel, the false wall sliding shut behind them. The air was damp and suffocating, but Emma kept moving, her adrenaline overriding her fear. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice hushed. "An old prohibition tunnel," Marisol replied. "Goes 2 blocks. It'll get us out." A crash echoed behind them. Emma's heart skipped as she realized the pursuers had found the hidden passage. "They're in the tunnel." "Run," Marisol ordered. The tunnel seemed endless, each step echoing like a drumbeat. Emma's lungs burned, her legs screaming for relief, but she didn't dare slow. At last, a sliver of light appeared ahead. The end of the tunnel. MSO. Legs to the exit first, pushing open a rusted metal grate that led into an alley. Emma scrambled through after her, the cool night air hitting her face like a blessing. "This way," Marisol said, tugging her toward a car parked nearby. They had barely climbed inside when a figure emerged from the tunnel, silhouetted against the faint light. Emma saw the glint of a weapon in his hand. "Go," she shouted. Mercoso lammed the gas, and the car screeched out of the alley just as a bullet shattered the rear window. Emma ducked, clutching the seat as shards of glass rained down around her. They sped through the empty streets, the headlights of another car appearing in the rearview mirror. They're chasing us. Emma cried. Marisol yanked the wheel, taking a hard turn onto a side street. Not for long. The car roared through the narrow streets, weaving through alleys and cutting through abandoned lots. Marisol's driving was relentless, her focus unbreakable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pursuing car vanished from sight. Marisol pulled into an overgrown lot and killed the engine. For a long moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. We're safe, Marisol said at last, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. Emma leaned back, her head spinning. What now? The night was far from over. After losing their pursuers, Emma and Marisol sat in tense silence, the car rattling along the uneven roads toward Emma's house. Every shadow, every passing car felt like a threat. We won't have much time, Marisol warned as they pulled into the driveway of Emma's modest home. They'll track us again soon. Emma nodded, her hands still trembling as she stepped out of the car. She led Marisol to the garage, her breath fogging in the chilly night air. The old shoebox had been shoved into a dusty corner years ago. She hadn't thought about it since. There, she whispered, pointing to a high shelf. Marisol grabbed a stool and climbed up. Pulling the box down and placing it on a nearby workbench, Emma's heart raced as she lifted the lid. The faint smell of old paper and sawdust wafting up. Inside, nestled among scraps of yellowed notes and trinkets, was her father's journal. She picked it up, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. The symbols etched into it, glowing faintly under the dim light, but it wasn't the journal that caught her attention. Beneath it lay a small, strange object, a relic. It was a wooden metal hybrid, unlike anything Emma had ever seen. The material shimmered with an otherworldly glow, as if it were alive. Strange symbols, similar to the ones in her father's journal, were etched along its surface. What is this? Emma asked, her voice trembling. Marisol's eyes widened. It's real, she whispered, reaching out to touch the relic. She hesitated, then pulled her hand back. Your father was protecting this? It's more valuable than I imagined. No wonder they're after you. A sudden noise outside, gravel crunching under tires, snapped them both back to reality. They found us, Marisol said, grabbing the relic and the journal. We need to move, now. Emma shoved the shoebox aside and followed Marisol out to the car. As they sped away, headlights appeared in the distance, closing in fast. Call someone, Emma urged, her voice tight with panic. Marisol's jaw tightened. I know someone. But you're not going to like it. She pulled out a sleek, untraceable phone and punched in a number. After a few terse words in a language Emma didn't understand, Marisol hung up and took a sharp turn down a narrow alley. The buildings loomed close on either side, their windows darkened. At the end of the alley, a solid brick wall blocked their path. What are you doing? Emma cried. Trust me, Marisol said. The car didn't slow. Emma braced herself for the impact, but instead of crashing, the wall began to shift. Bricks slid apart with mechanical precision, revealing a hidden passageway. The car roared inside, and the wall sealed shut behind them just as the pursuing vehicles screeched to a halt outside. The tunnel was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of oil and metal. As the car rolled to a stop, figures emerged from the shadows, tough-looking men and women, their faces scarred and hardened by years of danger. One of them, a tall man in a tailored suit, stepped forward. Marisol, he said, his voice smooth and low. It's been a while. Not long enough, she replied, climbing out of the car. She handed him the relic. I need your protection for this. And her, she added, gesturing to Emma. The man inspected the relic, his expression unreadable. Interesting. You always bring me the most troublesome problems. This one's worth it, Marisol said. She's the key to all of it. The man's gaze shifted to Emma, his eyes sharp and calculating. Welcome to the safe house, he said at last. You'll be safe here for now. But if you want to survive, you better start telling me everything you know. Emma gripped the journal tightly, her mind racing. She didn't trust these people, but for the moment she had no choice. Fine, she said, her voice steady. But first, tell me what this thing really is, and why it's worth my life. The man smiled faintly, gesturing for them to follow. Let's talk. As they disappeared deeper into the underground sanctuary, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a new kind of danger. One far more complicated than anything she had ever imagined. But now, with the journal and the relic in her possession, there was no turning back. The air in the underground safe house shifted as Marisol led Emma down a narrow corridor. The echoes of muffled voices and the clang of distant machinery faded, replaced by a strange, almost musical hum. At the end of the passage, a wooden door stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling through the cracks. Marisol paused. "This is where I leave you," she said. Emma frowned. "What? You're not coming in? This part isn't for me," Marisol replied cryptically. "Trust him. He knows more about this than anyone alive." Before Emma could question her further, Marisol turned and disappeared back into the shadows. Emma hesitated, then pushed the door open. The room she entered was unlike anything she had seen before. The walls were lined with bookshelves, overflowing with ancient tomes, strange artifacts, and glass jars filled with substances that glowed faintly in the dim light. At the center of the room sat a man in an intricately carved wooden chair, leaning slightly forward, hands outstretched toward a roaring fire. The man was old, his face lined with countless years, but his eyes sparkled with sharpness and a touch of mischief. His silver hair cascaded to his shoulders, and his robes were embroidered with symbols that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. The air was thick with a scent she couldn't place something floral, yet smoky, sweet but grounding. It wrapped around her, easing the tension in her chest. "Come in," the man said without looking at her. His voice was deep and soothing, carrying a weight of authority that made her legs move almost involuntarily. As Emma stepped closer, she noticed the relic in her hands had begun to glow even brighter, its warmth spreading through her palms. The old man finally turned to look at her, his expression softening as his gaze fell on the relic. He tilted his head slightly, as if greeting an old friend. "It has been a long time, my darling," he said, his voice filled with reverence. Emma blinked. "What? Are you talking to this?" She held up the relic. He chuckled softly. "It is not just this. It is a key, a guide, a memory. And yes, it is very much alive in its own way." Emma's mind swirled with questions, but before she could ask any, the man extended his hand. "May I?" She hesitated, gripping the relic tighter. "What are you going to do with it?" "Only awaken what has been waiting for centuries," he said, his tone kind but firm. Emma glanced at the glowing object in her hands, then back at the man. Something about him, his presence, his calm made her trust him. Slowly, she handed over the relic. The moment his fingers touched it, a strange wind swept through the room, despite them being deep underground. The fire in the hearth flared, casting wild shadows on the walls. Inscriptions etched into the stone walls began to glow, one by one, until the entire room was bathed in an ethereal light. The symbols seemed to pulse in rhythm with the relic, which now shimmered with a brilliance so intense that Emma had to shield her eyes. The old man closed his eyes, his lips moving silently as if in prayer or incantation. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating deep in Emma's chest. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man opened his eyes, now glowing faintly with the same light as the inscriptions. "It has begun," he said simply. "What has begun?" Emma asked, panic creeping into her voice. The man held the relic up, and the glowing symbols on the walls began to shift, forming a map, a swirling, living constellation of places and symbols that Emma couldn't begin to comprehend. "This," he said, gesturing to the map, "is what your father protected. The path to the knowledge they seek. Knowledge that, in the wrong hands, could reshape the world." Emma stared at the glowing map, her breath caught in her throat. "Why me? Why did my father hide this?" The man turned to her, his glowing eyes piercing. "Because he knew you would be the one to decide its fate. The relic chose you. And now, so must you choose." Before Emma could respond, a sudden pounding echoed from the door she had entered. "They found us." Marisol's voice rang out from the other side of the door. The man sighed as if expecting this. He handed the relic back to Emma, its glow dimming slightly as it touched her hands. "Go," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Follow the map." "You'll know where to go. What about you?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. "I'll hold them off. You have what they cannot." He smiled faintly, the light in his eyes growing brighter. "Now run, child. The world waits for no one." Emma hesitated for only a moment before gripping the relic tightly and turning toward the hidden passage Marisol had mentioned earlier. The glowing map etched into the walls remained imprinted in her mind, guiding her as she fled into the unknown. As Emma fled into the tunnel, the relic in her hands began to glow with an intensity she could barely comprehend. The soft hum it emitted grew louder, resonating in her chest until it became a deafening roar. The light filled the space, illuminating the path ahead, but also blinding her to the shadows beyond. The air around her seemed to ripple and twist, the relic pulsating as if it had a heartbeat of its own. She stumbled forward, shielding her eyes, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, without warning, a thunderous roar erupted from the earth, shaking the ground beneath her feet. The sound was deafening, like the collision of mountains or the birth of a storm. A crackling clap followed, splitting the air with such force that it seemed to rend reality itself. The light grew impossibly bright, enveloping her entirely. Her vision faded to white, her senses overwhelmed, and then silence. When Emma opened her eyes, she was no longer running through the underground passage. She was lying in her own bed, her sheets soaked with sweat. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. Her heart raced as she sat up, her head spinning. She touched her forehead, her fingers trembling. A dream, she whispered, her voice hoarse. It was just a dream. But as she glanced around the room, a strange unease crept over her. Something was off. Her eyes fell to her knitstand, where the journal and the relic sat side by side, the relic faintly glowing as if it were waiting for her. Her breath hitched, and she reached out to touch it. The warmth that radiated was unmistakable, the same she had felt in the tunnel. It wasn't a dream, she murmured, her voice shaking. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the faint echo of the old man's voice, calm and steady. The world waits for no one. Emma stared at the relic, its light growing slightly brighter under her touch. The weight of her father's legacy and the mystery of the map pressed down on her, but so did a newfound determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The end? Or perhaps just the beginning.